Email arrived at 10:07 a.m. on a Tuesday. No subject line, just a single, sterile attachment. A PDF. I knew before I opened it. You always do. It's a change in the air, a quiet hum of something ending. For 12 years I had been the voice of Cameron Wells. He was the literary superstar, the charismatic face on the talk show circuit, the name in glittering gold foil on the cover of 13 consecutive bestsellers. I was the ghost, a well-paid, anonymous, and utterly invisible secret. I took the paycheck. He took the credit. It was a simple, brutal transaction that had defined my entire professional life. My name is Caroline, and if you've ever felt like your contribution was erased, like your best work had someone else's name on it, then I need you to listen to this story. It helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void. So if you get it, truly get it, let me know in the comments below, and please, subscribe so we can continue this conversation. The PDF was a termination letter, dressed up in the most offensively cheerful corporate language imaginable. It spoke of a strategic realignment and a new creative direction. It thanked me for my invaluable contributions and wished me the best in all future endeavors. It was signed by his assistant, not even by him. After 12 years, 7 days a week, of bleeding my soul onto the page for him, he couldn't even sign his own name to the execution order. An hour later he called. His voice was slick with a practiced, artificial warmth that always set my teeth on edge. "Caroline, darling," he said, "I'm sure you've seen the email. This is a good thing, for both of us." He said he was finally ready to find his authentic voice. That was the phrase he used. Authentic voice. I almost laughed. The man didn't have an authentic voice. He had a series of well-marketed echoes, all of which originated with me. He told me this wasn't personal. It was just business. He said he was embarking on a new, deeply personal project, something only he could write. He was flying solo. I pictured a gilded peacock, trying to pilot a 747. I said nothing. I just listened to the sound of my own career, my stability, my entire constructed reality, being dismantled by a man who thought a thesaurus was a substitute for a soul. He said the severance was generous. He said I should be proud of what we'd built. We. As if we were ever a team. We were a king and a serf. A star and the dark matter that held his universe together. The final insult landed a week later. A courier delivered a package to my apartment. Inside was a leather-bound first edition of our last book, The Crimson Tide, the one that had just spent 6 months at #1. On the flyleaf, in his ostentatious, loopy handwriting, it read, "To Caroline, my secret weapon, with deepest gratitude for everything. Fly high, Cameron." I stared at the words, the casual, dismissive arrogance of them. A secret weapon. Something you keep in a box until you need it, and discard when you think the war is won. I placed the book on my coffee table, and the weight of it, the physical reality of 12 years of my life with his name on it, felt like a tombstone. It was over. He had fired his own voice, and I was, for the first time in over a decade, utterly, terrifyingly silent. The first 48 hours were a blur of numb efficiency. I responded to the termination letter with a single professionally courteous sentence confirming receipt. I transferred the severance pay, a lump sum that was indeed substantial, but felt more like blood money than a golden parachute, into a high-yield savings account. I did my laundry. I cleaned my small book-crammed apartment until the scent of lemon cleaner burned in my nostrils. I was a machine performing the tasks of a life that no longer felt like mine. The breakdown, when it came, wasn't a storm. It was a quiet, crushing tide. It happened on the 3rd day, sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot. I had gone out to buy milk and bread, mundane items for a life that felt anything but. A song came on the radio, one that had been the unofficial anthem of the book tour for our 7th novel, Winter's Bone. Cameron had loved it. He'd told an interviewer once that the song had inspired the entire emotional arc of the protagonist, a claim so breathtakingly false it had made me dizzy. I had written that arc on a rainy Tuesday in my old apartment, fueled by stale coffee and a deep, personal memory of my own grandfather's stoicism. The song had been playing in the cafe next door. It was background noise. He had stolen the memory, the emotion, the goddamn weather, and sold it as his own. And sitting there, with the stale air of the car pressing in on me, the dam broke. It wasn't a loud, sobbing grief. It was a silent weeping, hot tears tracking down my face as the full weight of the erasure hit me. 12 years. 12 years of being the architect of a world everyone else thought he had built. I had given him his best lines, his most profound insights, his most heartbreaking character deaths. I had written the words that made millions of readers feel seen, and I had remained invisible. My mind started to spool backwards, picking at the loose threads of the past, trying to understand how I had let it happen. It hadn't started as a grand deception. It started with desperation. I was 28, with a mountain of student debt and a master's in literature that was proving to be worth less than the paper it was printed on. My mother was sick, the early stages of a degenerative illness that would require years of expensive care. I was working 3 part-time jobs and barely treading water. Then came the offer, through a mutual acquaintance. Cameron Wells, a moderately successful, but critically ignored author, had a killer concept for a thriller but couldn't seem to execute it. He had writer's block, he claimed. The truth, I'd soon learn, was that he didn't have writer's block. He simply couldn't write. His prose was clunky, his dialogue was tin-eared, and his sense of pacing was non-existent. He was a brilliant marketer, a charming salesman of ideas, but he was not a writer. We met in a soulless hotel bar. He was magnetic. He leaned in, made intense eye contact, and sold me on a vision. Just this one book, he'd said, to get me over the hump. We'll split the advance, but my name has to be on it. The publisher knows the Cameron Wells brand. I needed the money. I needed it more than I needed the credit. So I agreed. It was a Faustian bargain, signed in a cocktail napkin, and sealed with a handshake that felt both electric and damning. That first book was Echo Harbor. It exploded. I remember seeing it in a bookstore window for the first time, my words, my characters, under his name. It was a bizarre cocktail of emotions, a fierce, secret pride, mixed with a profound sense of alienation. At the launch party, he pulled me aside, his eyes glittering with triumph and champagne. "You're my secret weapon, Caroline," he'd whispered, a phrase that felt like a compliment then, but curdled into a cage over the years. The success created an unstoppable momentum. One book became 2, then 5, then 10. The paychecks got bigger. I was able to afford the best care for my mother, moving her into a facility with round-the-clock nurses. That was the anchor that held me in place. Every time I felt the sting of his arrogance, every time he took a bow for a line I'd wept over while writing, I thought of my mother's safety. I told myself it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a trade. My name for her life. It was a debatable choice, I know. A person with more self-worth might have walked away sooner, but my loyalty wasn't to Cameron, it was to her. My choices were made out of love and necessity, a logic that the world of ambition and ego could never understand. Over the years, the slights had accumulated like layers of silt, burying my own identity. There was the time at a publisher's meeting in New York. I was there as his research assistant, a fiction we maintained for the inner circle. I had pitched a complex subplot for what would become The Glass Spire. Cameron had waved it away dismissively in the room, saying it was too convoluted. A week later, I saw an email he'd sent to our editor, Arthur Finch, pitching the exact same idea, almost word for word, as a brilliant epiphany he'd had on the flight home. I saw the look Arthur gave me across the table at our next meeting. It was a flicker of something, pity, understanding, complicity. He knew Arthur Finch was a quiet, owl-like man who had been our editor from the beginning. He was old-school publishing, a man who cared more for the quality of a sentence than the size of an advance. He was the one person in the whole machinery who I felt saw the ghost in the machine. He'd send edit notes on the manuscripts that were clearly directed at me. He'd comment on passages with phrases like "this metaphor feels like your earlier work in Echo Harbor," or "the rhythm in this chapter is pure Caroline." He never said it outright, but it was his way of acknowledging my existence. Those small coded messages were life rafts in a sea of anonymity. I remembered one manuscript where Cameron had tried to punch up a chapter, adding a dozen exclamation points and a car chase that made no sense. Arthur had sent it back with a single note in the margin, written in red pen: "Stet." The original was perfect. "Stet. Let it stand." He was my silent ally, protecting my work from the man whose name was on the cover. Back in my car, in the parking lot, the memory of Arthur's small acts of validation was a pinprick of light in the darkness. The self-pity began to recede, replaced by a slow, cold burn. The tears stopped. I put the car in drive. As I pulled out onto the street, I saw a billboard for Cameron's upcoming media tour, a massive, airbrushed photo of his face, looking pensive and profound. The tagline read, "Cameron Wells, the authentic voice of a generation." That was it. That was the moment the grief died, and the resolve was born. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it. He hadn't just fired me. He hadn't just erased me. He was now using my own legacy to build his next chapter, a chapter based on the lie of his authenticity. I went home. I made a pot of coffee, the strong black kind that had fueled a dozen bestsellers. I sat down at my laptop, the one that wasn't owned by his company, the one he didn't know about. For 12 years I had channeled my creativity into the vessel of Cameron Wells. He had been the filter, the brand, the name on the package. Now, the filter was gone. I was alone with my own voice for the first time since I was 28 years old, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. It wasn't about revenge. I told myself that, over and over again, a mantra to keep the rage from boiling over. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I opened a blank document, and I began to write. The first few weeks were an exorcism. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I lived on coffee and the ferocious energy that comes from a decade of suppressed creativity finally being unleashed. The story poured out of me not like a river but like a flash flood, carving new canyons in its path. I wasn't writing a memoir. A direct tell-all would have been a legal nightmare, a messy, public battle that would have painted me as a disgruntled employee. My non-disclosure agreement, which I had signed all those years ago in a haze of financial desperation, was a fortress. It was designed to prevent exactly this. It stipulated that I could never claim authorship of the Cameron Wells books, nor could I disclose the nature of our working arrangement. A lawsuit would be his territory. A war of attrition fought by expensive lawyers. I had no interest in that kind of fight. My plan was more elegant, more surgical. My NDA had a loophole, a tiny crack in the armor that I was now going to drive a wedge into. It prevented me from talking about my work for Cameron Wells, but it could not, legally, prevent me from writing fiction, my own fiction. So that's what I did. I decided to write a novel. The premise was simple, almost allegorical. It was the story of a world-famous, charismatic painter named Julian Croft, a man celebrated for his profound, soul-stirring masterpieces. But Julian had a secret. He wasn't the painter, he was the finisher. The real artist was a reclusive woman named Elias, who would create these vast, complex canvases, and Julian's only job was to add the final signature brushstroke and take the bow. The novel was about their toxic symbiosis, the lie at the heart of the art world, and what happens when Elias finally decides to pick up a brush for herself. The parallels to my life were so screamingly obvious to anyone who knew the truth that it was almost comical, yet it was cloaked in the safe, deniable armor of fiction. I called it the Gilded Cage. As I wrote, I realized my true secret weapon wasn't just my talent, it was my archive. For 12 years I had been meticulous. I had a separate, encrypted hard drive, my archive of authenticity, as I called it. On it was every draft of every chapter of every Cameron Wells book. I had the initial, clumsy, often incoherent pages he would send me, filled with platitudes and half-formed ideas, and I had my versions, the ones that took his straw and spun it into gold. I had emails, notes, outlines, and character sketches. It was a mountain of digital evidence, a perfect, time-stamped record of the entire creative process. It showed, without a shadow of a doubt, where his work ended and mine began. I had no intention of releasing this archive to the public. That would be messy, a he-said-she-said battle. Instead, I used it as my own private fuel. When my confidence wavered, when I felt the ghost of Cameron's condescending voice in my head, I would open a file. I'd read one of his original chapters, a mess of cliches and dangling plot threads, and then I'd read my final version. It was a powerful reminder. I wasn't just his ghostwriter. I was the reason he was a star. I had the skill. He just had the name. My developing subplot, the quiet thread of connection with Arthur Finch, the editor, became a source of strength. I thought about him often as I wrote. I imagined him reading The Gilded Cage. I pictured his quiet, knowing smile as he recognized my literary fingerprints, the specific cadence of a sentence, a particular way of structuring a chapter, the deep, resonant emotionality that was my true signature. He was my ideal reader, the one person in the world who would understand the book on every level, both as a piece of fiction and as a declaration of independence. His imagined validation kept me going through the long nights. He represented the part of the industry that still cared about the work, not just the brand. After 3 months of relentless, feverish work, the manuscript was done. It was raw, powerful, and the best thing I had ever written. It was my voice, undiluted and unapologetic. Now came the hard part, getting it published. I needed an agent. I couldn't go to the big agencies, the ones intertwined with Cameron's publisher. I needed someone independent, someone hungry. I remembered a woman named Lena Petrova. I'd met her briefly at a literary event years ago. She had a reputation for being a shark, a fierce advocate for her clients with a disdain for the bloated, self-important establishment. She ran a small boutique agency. She was perfect. I drafted a query letter, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. I attached the first 50 pages and hit send, expecting to wait months for a reply, if I got one at all. Lena replied in 3 hours. The email was one line: "Send me the rest. Now." I sent the full manuscript. The next morning, my phone rang. It was her. Her voice was electric, a rapid-fire staccato of excitement. "This is a masterpiece, Caroline," she said. "Where the hell have you been?" I gave her the heavily redacted version of my past, citing an ironclad NDA, but hinting at a long-term ghostwriting gig for a major author. She didn't press. She was smart enough to read between the lines. She said, "I don't care who you were. I care about who you are now. And who you are is a goddamn star. I'm going to sell this book, and we are going to make them pay attention." Lena was a force of nature. She understood the strategy immediately. We couldn't sell it to Cameron's publisher, Sterling and Ross. They would bury it to protect their golden boy. We needed a rival, a smaller, more agile house that would relish the opportunity to tweak the nose of the industry giant. She drew up a list of independent publishers, known for taking risks on bold literary fiction. The submission process was a lesson in patience. There were rejections, of course. Some editors found it too provocative. Others were nervous about the unspoken implications. Lena was relentless. She called in favors. She created buzz. She was my champion, my noise in a world where I had been silent for too long. Finally, we got the offer. It was from a fiercely independent press, Blackwood Books. They weren't a massive conglomerate, but they were respected. Their offer wasn't a king's ransom, but it was fair. And more importantly, their editor-in-chief, a sharp woman named Sarah Chen, loved the book with a passion that matched Lena's. In her call with us, she said something that stuck with me. "This isn't just a novel," she said. "It's a reckoning." They were all in. While my book was going through the long process of editing and production, news of Cameron's authentic new book started to saturate the media. It was called Echoes of Self. The irony was so thick I could taste it. His marketing machine went into overdrive. There were fawning profiles, slick interviews, and a cover reveal on a morning talk show. He talked about his journey of self-discovery, the painful but necessary process of stripping away the old to find the new. He was using the language of rebirth and authenticity, all while preparing to release what I knew would be a hollow shell. I watched it all, with a strange sense of detachment. It felt like watching a storm gather on a distant horizon. I knew my own storm was coming, and it would be quieter, but far more devastating. I had built my plan, not on public accusations or legal threats, but on a simple, undeniable foundation: quality. I had written my truth. Now all I had to do was wait for the world to read it. The two books were released within a week of each other. It was a coincidence of scheduling that felt like fate. Cameron's Echoes of Self landed first, with the force of a 10-ton marketing budget. It was everywhere: airport bookstores, morning show segments, front-of-store displays. Sterling and Ross had pushed all their chips into the center of the table. My book, The Gilded Cage, slipped into the world much more quietly. Blackwood Books, my independent publisher, had a fraction of the budget. There was no talk show tour, no giant billboards. There was just the book itself, sent out to reviewers and booksellers, with a quiet confidence that I found more reassuring than any marketing blitz. The first sign that the tides were turning came from the critics. The reviews for Echoes of Self were not just bad, they were catastrophic. They were brutal, almost gleeful in their takedown. "A work of staggering narcissism," wrote the New York Times. "A hollow man shouting into a void and hearing only his own empty echo," said a prominent literary journal. They savaged his prose, calling it pompous, incoherent, and a masterclass in mixed metaphors. The man who had built a career on a voice I had given him was now being publicly flayed for having no voice of his own. I didn't feel joy. I felt a cold, clean sense of validation. It was like a mathematical equation that had finally been solved. Meanwhile, the first reviews for The Gilded Cage started to trickle in. They were glowing. "A stunning debut from a powerful, fully formed new voice," one critic wrote. "A surgically precise and heartbreaking novel about art, authenticity, and the hidden labor of female genius," wrote another. They praised the prose, the characters, the emotional depth. They praised the very things I had been forced to suppress for 12 years. The real battle, however, would be fought in the court of public opinion, on the sales charts. For the first week, Cameron's book, buoyed by its massive marketing push and pre-orders, debuted at number 3 on the bestseller list. It was a respectable showing, but far below the number 1 spot that was considered automatic for a Cameron Wells novel. My book was nowhere to be seen on the main list, though it did hit number 12 on the extended debut author list. Lena called me. "Don't watch the numbers day by day," she said. "This is a marathon, not a sprint." Then the word of mouth began. My book, championed by independent booksellers and voracious readers, started to build a groundswell of support. Book clubs picked it up. Influential readers on social media began to rave about it. A quiet buzz turned into a loud hum. The second week's numbers came out. Cameron's book had dropped from number 3 to number 9. The drop-off was precipitous, a sign of terrible word of mouth. My book, The Gilded Cage, had appeared on the main list for the first time, at number 15, and then the article came out. It was a long-form piece in a major online literary magazine, by a notoriously sharp-eyed critic. The headline was "The Ghost and the Echo." The critic didn't claim to have inside information. He didn't need to. He simply did a close reading of both books. He compared the prose of Echoes of Self to the prose of the earlier Cameron Wells novels, and then he compared it to the prose in The Gilded Cage. He put sentences side by side. He analyzed the cadence, the imagery, the thematic concerns. His conclusion was devastating. He wrote, "To read Echoes of Self after a career of enjoying the work of Cameron Wells is a jarring experience. The fluid, emotionally resonant prose is gone, replaced by a clumsy, self-important style. But to read Caroline Reed's The Gilded Cages is to find that missing voice, reborn." One can't help but wonder if the authentic voices of Cameron Wells all these years was, in fact, someone else entirely. The article was a nuke. It went viral, and the literary world exploded with speculation. The subtext became the main text. The quiet part was now being said out loud. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was for New York. I hesitated, then answered. Caroline? The voice was quiet, familiar. It was Arthur Finch, Cameron's editor, my silent ally. My heart hammered against my ribs. Arthur, I said. My own voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause. I could hear the hum of an office in the background. I just wanted to call and say, "Congratulations," he said. His voice was thick with unspoken meaning. "It's a remarkable book. Truly. Thank you." I managed to say. Another pause, then he said the words that unlocked everything. "I always knew it was you, Caroline. The real work. It was always you." Tears pricked my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. It was a validation more profound than any bestseller list or royalty statement. He knew. He had always known. "I've got to go," he said abruptly. "Well done," and he hung up. I knew that call wasn't just a personal courtesy. It was a signal. The ground was shifting. The silent takeover I had planned was no longer silent. The entire publishing industry was now listening. Cameron's kingdom, built on the sand of a single monumental lie, was about to be washed away by the tide, and I was the tide. The fallout from the article was swift and brutal. The narrative had been set. Cameron Wells was a fraud, and Caroline Reed was the secret genius behind the throne. Sales of Echoes of Self didn't just decline, they cratered. Bookstores started returning their unsold copies in droves. The social media mockery was relentless. The Cameron Wells brand, once a mark of quality and prestige, had become a punchline. Inversely, The Gilded Cage became a phenomenon. Readers flocked to it, not just because it was a great novel, but because it was part of a spectacular story of vindication. It was the ultimate insider tell-all, hidden in plain sight. My publisher, Blackwood Books, rushed to print more copies, struggling to keep up with the demand. 2 weeks after the article dropped, the new bestseller list came out. The Gilded Cage was at number 1. It had dethroned a political thriller that had been camped out there for weeks. Cameron's book had fallen off the list entirely. It was a complete and total reversal of fortune. The ghost was now sitting on the throne. The real drama, however, was happening behind the closed doors of Sterling and Ross, Cameron's publisher. I could only imagine the panic. They had invested millions in Cameron's multi-book contract, a massive advance based on a history of success I had created. Now they were sitting on a toxic asset and a monumental financial loss. They were hemorrhaging money and, more importantly, credibility. The call I had been waiting for finally came. It wasn't from Cameron. It wasn't even from Arthur. It was from the assistant to Marcus Thorne, the formidable, silver-haired head of Sterling and Ross. He wanted a meeting with me. Lena, my agent, was ecstatic. "This is it," she said, her voice crackling with energy. "They're bleeding, and you're holding the tourniquet. Don't say anything in that meeting. Just listen. Let them talk. We have all the leverage." I walked into the Sterling and Ross headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, feeling a strange sense of calm. It was the same building, the same plush carpets, the same hushed, reverent atmosphere I had known for 12 years as a silent partner. But this time, I wasn't being shuffled in through a side door. The receptionist knew my name. I was walking in as the author of the #1 best-selling book in the country. I was shown into the main conference room, a cavernous space with a polished mahogany table and a panoramic view of the city. It was the exact same room where Cameron had held his victory parties, the same room where he'd condescendingly dismissed my ideas. At the head of the table sat Marcus Thorne. To his right sat Arthur Finch. Cameron was conspicuously absent. Marcus looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His tailored suit was impeccable, but his face was haggard. He stood up, forcing a smile that didn't reach his tired eyes. "Caroline," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." I sat opposite him, placing my hands calmly on the table. Arthur gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. He looked just as tired as Marcus, but there was a glint in his eye I hadn't seen before. It looked like relief. Marcus launched into a rambling monologue, full of flattery and corporate speak. He praised my novel, calling it breathtaking and a triumph. He talked about the unfortunate market reaction to Cameron's latest work. He was circling the point, trying to find a way in. I remained silent, just as Lena had advised. I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and uncomfortable for him. Finally, he cracked. He leaned forward, dropping the pretense. "Look, Caroline," he said, his voice low and desperate. "We have a problem, a big one. The Cameron Wells brand is damaged. We've had to terminate the remainder of his contract. The losses are significant." I just looked at him, my expression unreadable. "We need to salvage this," he continued, gesturing around the room, as if the walls themselves were at stake. 12 years of bestsellers. It's a valuable backlist. We can't let it all just evaporate. He took a deep breath. This was it, the pitch. "Here we have an idea, a way to reframe the narrative, a way to turn this disaster into an opportunity." He glanced at Arthur, who gave a slight, affirming nod. "We want to commission a book," Marcus said, "an official, authorized biography of Cameron Wells, a definitive, tell-all account of his life and career." He paused, letting the words sink in. My mind was racing, but my face remained a mask of calm. I knew what was coming next, and the sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "And we want you to write it," he said, the words rushing out, your name on the cover, above his. "The Life of Cameron Wells," by Caroline Reed. "We'll give you complete access, complete creative control, and an advance that will make your last one look like pocket change." The offer hung in the air, shimmering with a kind of desperate, poetic insanity. They were in a hole so deep, their only solution was to hand me the shovel and pay me to keep digging. They weren't just offering me a job, they were offering me the keys to the kingdom. They were asking the ghost to write the official history of the man she had haunted, the man who had tried to exorcise her. It was the ultimate power shift. The creator was finally being asked to take control of her creation. I let the silence stretch for a full minute, watching the sweat bead on Marcus Thorne's temple. I thought about the 12 years of anonymity, the stolen credit, the condescending pats on the head. I thought about him calling me his secret weapon and then discarding me. I thought about my book, The Gilded Cage, and his book, Echoes of Self. Finally I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the vast room. "It's an interesting offer, Marcus," I said. "But before I even consider it, there's one condition." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "Anything, name it. I want to talk to him," I said. "I want to talk to Cameron." A flicker of panic crossed Marcus's face, but he quickly suppressed it. He looked at Arthur, who gave a resigned sigh. The publisher had clearly sidelined Cameron entirely, but my request put him back in the picture, a ghost at their own feast. Marcus knew he had no choice. He had ceded all power in the room to me. "I'll arrange it," he said, his voice raspy. "I'll arrange the call." The next day, sitting in Lena's sleek, minimalist office, the call came through. Lena put it on speakerphone. Marcus was on the line first, his voice tight. "Caroline, Cameron is here." Then, another voice, a voice I knew better than my own, yet it sounded thin, reedy, stripped of all its practiced, booming confidence. "Caroline," Cameron said. I said nothing. I let him hang there in the silence. "Caroline, listen," he began, his words stumbling over each other. "I hear they've made you an offer. I think it's a wonderful idea, a chance for us to set the record straight, to tell our story, our story." The arrogance was so deeply ingrained, he couldn't even see it. He was still trying to co-opt my narrative, to frame this utter humiliation as a collaboration. He kept talking, a pathetic stream of justifications and appeals to a shared history that had been a lie. He talked about our partnership, the magic we created. He said he never meant for things to end the way they did, that he was under a lot of pressure. He was trying to cast himself as a victim of circumstance. I listened, my face impassive. Lena watched me, a small satisfied smile playing on her lips. I let him completely run out of steam, until his pleading just trailed off into a weak, questioning silence. Then I spoke. My voice was cold and clear as ice. "Cameron," I said, cutting through the static of his excuses. 12 years ago, you told me that you needed to find your authentic voice. It seems you finally did." I paused, letting the weight of that statement land, and the world has given its review. The silence on the line was absolute. I could almost hear his blood turning to ice water. "My novel is about a charismatic fraud," I continued, my voice calm and surgically precise. "Your own publisher, the one who just fired you, now wants me to write your official non-fiction biography. They're giving me full control of your legacy. My name will be on the cover." I leaned closer to the phone. "So tell me, Cameron, what do you think the theme of the book should be? I'm open to suggestions." It was checkmate. There was no response, no bluster, no argument, no pathetic pleading, just the sound of his ragged breathing, the sound of a king realizing he was not just naked, but had never been wearing any clothes at all. I didn't need to hear him concede. The silence was his surrender. "Thank you for your input," I said softly, and I signaled for Lena to end the call. The sound of the disconnect was one of the most satisfying sounds I had ever heard. It wasn't about revenge, I kept telling myself that. It was a simple course correction. It was about truth finally finding its own level. I looked at Lena. "Tell Marcus I accept the offer," I said, but my fee just doubled. I took the deal. I signed the contract in Lena's office, the paper thick and important in my hands. My name, Caroline Reed, was in a large, bold font. The advance was, as promised, life-altering. But it wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about the power to write the official history, to define the narrative. My first act as the authorized biographer of Cameron Wells was to request access to the Sterling and Ross archives. All of it. Every email, every memo, every draft of his that they had on file. My primary partner in this endeavor was Arthur Finch. He was assigned as my editor for the project, a move I had insisted on. Our first meeting was in his cluttered, cozy office, a room that smelled of old paper and fresh coffee. It was a sanctuary of words in the cold, corporate monolith. He had stacks of files on his desk, the complete history of the Cameron Wells literary empire. "The archive of authenticity," I said, gesturing to the boxes. Arthur looked up from a file, a weary but genuine smile on his face. "I've been going through some of the early material," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "The original manuscript for Echo Harbor, Caroline. What you did, it was more than ghostwriting. It was alchemy. You didn't just polish his work, you resurrected it from the dead. We spent weeks together, sifting through the digital and physical detritus of a dozen years. For him, it was a professional revelation. For me, it was a strange, emotional archaeology. We unearthed the clumsy first draft emails from Cameron, and then the polished, perfect chapters I had sent back. Arthur would just shake his head, muttering, "Incredible." He was my witness, the one person who saw the full scope of the deception and the full scale of my contribution. He had suspected it for years, but now he had the proof. His quiet, steady validation was the foundation on which I built the biography. I didn't write a hatchet job. That would have been too easy, too crude. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. What I felt was a cold, clarifying purpose. I wrote a nuanced, deeply researched, and surgically precise book. It was a psychological portrait of a man so desperate for fame that he outsourced his own soul. It was a business story about the creation of a brand, and it was a literary detective story, showing the subtle, undeniable fingerprints of a hidden hand in the work. I didn't need to call him a fraud. I just laid out the evidence, piece by piece, and let the reader draw their own inescapable conclusion. The working title I chose was The Ghost and the Echo. The publication of the biography a year later was a major cultural event. It was serialized in magazines, debated on talk shows, and dissected by critics. It was hailed as a masterpiece of the genre, both for its literary quality and for the unbelievable story behind it. It cemented Cameron's fate not as a monster, but as a tragic, hollow figure, a man who had the world but never had a voice. And it cemented my reputation. I was no longer the ghost. I was one of the most respected writers in the country. The final, perfect moment of vindication came a few months after the biography was released. I was invited onto a prestigious late-night talk show, the kind Cameron had been a regular on for years. I sat on the same couch, where he had once told the host that his ideas came to him in dreams. The host, a woman I admired, held up both of my books. The Gilded Cage, my novel, was in its second year on the bestseller list. The Ghost and the Echo, my biography, had been at #1 for 12 straight weeks. Caroline, the host said, her eyes warm and intelligent. 2 #1 bestsellers in a single year, after a lifetime of anonymity. It's one of the most incredible stories in publishing history. Tell me, how does it feel to finally be using your own voice? I paused, looking past the bright lights and the cameras, out into the darkness where the audience sat. But I wasn't talking to them. I was talking to you, to the person listening to this right now who has ever felt invisible. I said, it feels like coming home. This story, my story, was never really about one man or one industry. It's for every single person who has ever poured their heart and soul into a project, only to see someone else sign their name to it. It's for everyone who has had their ideas dismissed in a meeting, only to hear their boss repeat them as their own a week later. It's for anyone who has been told to be a team player, when it really meant be quiet and let me take the credit. What I learned is that true value, real talent, is like water. You can try to dam it up, you can try to divert it, you can try to contain it for the benefit of someone else. But eventually, inevitably, it will find its own level. It will carve its own path. The truth has a weight and a gravity all its own, and in the end it will always, always break through. Your contribution matters. Your work has worth. Your voice deserves to be heard. And most importantly, your name, the one that belongs to you and you alone, is the only one that should be on the cover of your own life. Never let anyone, no matter how powerful or charismatic, convince you otherwise. Thank you for listening to my story. If any part of this resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the ghost in your own career, please let me know in the comments below. It truly helps to know that we're not alone in these fights. And if you want to hear more stories about taking back your power, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. There are many more chapters to write.